Gente, agora a gente vai falar de um assunto interessante, que é um marketplace de produtos manufaturados, feitos pela mão, artesanato, sumiu a palavra, de produtos artesanais africanos que está sendo vendido e disponibilizado aí por todo mundo, né? Então, para a gente começar, eu vou chamar ela aqui, que é conselheira independente de administração, que faz parte do Conselho do Capitalismo Consciente Brasil, é cofundadora da Conselheira 101, programa que visa a inclusão de mulheres negras em conselhos de administração, foi subsecretária de empreendedorismo das micro e pequenas empresas do Estado de São Paulo e diretora executiva do Banco do Povo Paulista. Ela é professora de finanças corporativas e escritora, lançou 3 livros em coautoria, Mulheres nos Conselhos, Mulheres nas Finanças, Mentores e Sua História. Por favor, uma salva de palmas para Janda Araújo, cofundadora e conselheira do Conselheira 101.
Bem-vinda, Janda. E agora eu vou convidar também a Jennifer. A palestra vai ser em inglês, então vou fazer a intro dela em inglês. She is the CEO and co-founder of Mawu, Africa. She has extensive experience with fintechs and e-commerce. She worked with a talented group of Africans, craft people, to showcase their work online, making it accessible to buyers all around the world. Jennifer Nyambogo, please come to the stage. Thank you.
Oi, pessoal. Or Jambo, as we'll say it in Kenya. I am so excited to be here with you today. My name is Nyambogo Jennifer, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Mawu Africa. So Mawu is a marketplace that connects global buyers like yourself here in Sao Paulo with very, very talented craftspeople on the African continent. So I come from a very beautiful country in Kenya, in East Africa called Kenya. So just a few facts about Kenya. Kenya is the 56th largest e-commerce market in the world and happens to be Africa's third largest e-commerce market after South Africa and Nigeria. So it's such an honor for me to be here today, not only representing Kenya and Africa, but to offer you some insights if you're interested in doing business in Africa and how to go around it. So just to give you a rundown of our conversation today, I'll be covering the e-commerce landscape on the African continent and offering you some insights around setting up an e-commerce business on the continent and just some considerations to think about when it comes to payments, logistics, and most importantly, customer experience when doing e-commerce in Africa. So let's get into it. So let me take you back to 2020 when the global pandemic hits. And there's all this craziness happening across the world. There are massive lockdowns on a global scale. People look at you weirdly if you cough or sneeze. Members of the clergy have found very interesting ways to baptize children. And my personal favorite, the global shortage of tissue paper. Who would have thought? But as all this is happening across the world, in Nairobi and all across Africa, something very sad and devastating is happening. There's a whole industry that's on the brink of extinction, and this is the creative manufacturing industry. So allow me to introduce you to Naitemu. Naitemu is a very, very talented bead weaver from Kenya. She comes from the Maasai community of Kenya and Tanzania. And the Maasai in Africa are known for their rich cultural heritage, but more than that, the Maasai are known for their impeccable craftsmanship. Like most craftspeople in Africa, Naitemu has learned the art of beadwork from her mom, as it's passed down from generation to generation, and she intends to pass down this old-age technique to her daughters also. But as the pandemic looms, Naitemu has been reconsidering if she really wants to continue with this old-age technique, as she earns little money from it, and she has a huge family that depends on her. And Naitemu's case is not unique. All across Africa, there are over 8 million craftspeople on the continent that rely on craft-making skills to make a living. However, these craftspeople really struggle to access markets and connect with buyers who will love to buy their items. And the reason being, craftspeople on the African continent operate in very remote areas, and as a result, they are either forced to rely on middlemen, open-air markets, or sometimes tourism for them to make a living. So let me bring you back here today in Sao Paulo. We're in Brazil, and I'm on stage, and you're thinking, oh, this is quite a very interesting pattern of clothing that Jennifer is wearing. I love her earrings. I would love to buy some of the items that Jennifer is wearing today. But how do I go about it? And I'm all the way in Brazil. So where will I be able to buy these items? Can I be able to shop in Portuguese, pay in Brazilian real? And will my item be delivered all the way to Africa, to Sao Paulo, and when will I get it? And how much will I buy this item? Will it be very expensive for me because I'm in all the way in Latin America? Is this an authentic craft? And can I trust the platform that I buy this craft from? So if you're in Sao Paulo and you're wondering this is the same global buyers all across the world think about when trying to buy creative goods from the African continent. And this can be summarized as barriers around language, culture, and currency. So in comes Mawu. So Mawu is a marketplace that connects very talented craftspeople like Naitemu with global buyers like yourself here in Sao Paulo. We provide an easy, fast, and secure way for global buyers and African craftspeople to connect and trade. So how exactly does Mawu work? Like any other marketplace, it starts with the supply end. So craftspeople like Naitemu go on the platform and list the products that they have. And then global buyers can go on the platform, browse these products, add to cart and check out. When that happens, the craftsperson receives the order, they package it well, take it to a Mawu fulfillment center, then Mawu goes ahead and does the last mile logistics to buyers all across the world. So I've talked nicely about Mawu and all the opportunities that are there for marketplaces, but let's look at why is this the best time for you here in Brazil to consider doing business in Africa, especially around building marketplaces. And I'll start with COVID, as I mentioned. Not only in Africa, but all across the world, COVID has accelerated the adoption of e-commerce on the globe. And the same has been true for Africa. But something quite interesting is happening in Africa. So 90% of our population on the continent is either unbanked or underbanked. As a result, it has forced us to come up with very innovative ways of transferring money. And one of the most innovative ways of payments or transferring money on the African continent has been mobile banking. So I'll just talk briefly about mobile banking, and we'll talk about it later. But mobile banking is a platform that allows users to send and receive money without using the traditional forms of banking like a traditional bank. So it works on a 2G network. So as long as you have a SIM card, like an example here, if I had a Claro SIM card, I can actually transfer money to you, to a business, or make other payments without having a traditional bank. But we'll talk more about mobile banking as we have this conversation together. The other interesting thing that's happening on the African continent is let me show you, handsets, mobile penetration. So in Africa, most people will not be able to afford a laptop or a desktop, so everyone has one of these. And sometimes everyone has one or two of these. For example, if you're a man, you have one for your girlfriend, another one for your wife. But mobile headsets in Africa are very common. And as a result, the internet penetration also in the continent is quite high. So everything on the African continent is mobile first. If you're going to build a platform on Africa, think about optimizing it for mobile. And then the other interesting thing that's happening on the African continent, we have one of the most youngest population, but a population that is very tech savvy. So you find young people want to buy event tickets online, want to buy food online, want to connect with other people online, other people across the world online. So these are some of the factors that have made it easy for e-commerce adoption in Africa and for marketplaces to come about. So let's look at how do you go about building a global marketplace for African crafts and what we're doing at Mawu. And I hope these insights are some of the things you can consider when setting up a marketplace in Africa. So the first thing any other marketplace faces across the world is the question of supply versus demand, or what we call the chicken versus egg problem. So who do you start with? Do you start with the supplier, the producer, or do you start with the demand, the buyer? So for us at Mawu, it was obvious to start with the supplier, who is the craftsperson, and then build the infrastructure, and then deal with demand later. So I'll take you through the journey of building Mawu from supply, how we onboard craftspeople on the continent. I'll also take you through some of the infrastructure we have on the platform around logistics, payments, and finally I'll talk about customer experience. So let's get into how do we onboard craftspeople on the platform. I love to mention that crafts in Africa are produced in very unique ways. Every community in Africa produces crafts. This is because if I'm in Brazil, you will think crafts is something beautiful to hang, but in Africa, these craft items have very practical uses. So right now you'll find a woman going to the market wearing this. If you're producing a piece of painting, sometimes it's used in ancestral worship or trying to connect to our heritage. So crafts have a very sentimental attachment in our culture. But in modern times, in Africa, crafts have been created by 4 levels of producers. The first level is artisans, like Naitemu that you met. And then we have a level of artisan groups where different Naitemus come together and form a brand. We have artisanal groups or brands, and then finally we have vulnerable groups. And I'd love to talk about some of these vulnerable groups. An example of some of the vulnerable groups that we work with are persons with disability, who create crafts to make a living for themselves. We also have women who've gone through domestic violence and are trying to make crafts to earn economic empowerment from their partners. And finally, we have refugee artisans. So there's a lot of civil war that happens in Africa sometimes, and you find refugee artisans when they move to different regions of Africa, try to create crafts to earn economic empowerment. But all across these 4 levels, there's a criteria, 3 main criteria that we look at when onboarding craftspeople. So the first one is the products have to be exclusively made in the African continent. This is because we wanted to give these creative producers an opportunity for them to connect with the rest of the world in a way they were not able to do before. The second thing that we look at is the level of craftsmanship. As I'd mentioned, craft making in Africa is not taught in schools. It's something that is passed down through apprenticeship from generation to generation. So it's that heritage that trickles down through communities, and it's able to now, using Mawu, to be spread to the rest of the world. The other thing that we are keen about when onboarding craftspeople is the issue of sustainability. And this goes again to our culture and our heritage as African people. We believe that anything produced on the continent or produced through the crafts heritage area should be good for the humans and good for the planet. So in our culture, it's taboo to create something, or bad karma as we call it, to create something that causes harm to other people or causes harm to the environment. So those are the things that we look at when onboarding craftspeople. As a result, currently at Mawu, we have craftspeople from 4 African countries, Kenya being our main one, but we also have craft makers from Uganda, Tanzania, and DRC Congo. So I would love to take you through payments on Mawu. As I'd mentioned, payments in Africa are very innovative, and in this case, I'll talk a lot about mobile banking. Let me give you, this is a very good scenario of how mobile banking works in Africa. This shop, we call them a kiosk in Africa. So you go to a kiosk with physical money, like in this case, I will go with my Brazilian real. Then I'll give the shopkeeper this money. Then the shopkeeper will tokenize the money in my phone, in my SIM card, and then I'll receive that money. So I'll use the value of that money to either make transfers, let me just go back, to either make transfers to you today, if I wanted to send you money. I can use the same token to pay to a business, and a business can use the same token to pay to another business or to pay directly to other consumers. And let me just apply the same on how Mawu works. So Mawu, how we receive customer payments on the platform, especially for African customers, we use mobile money again, mobile banking. So someone can be able to pay us on the platform using mobile banking, the token that we've mentioned that is sent to your SIM card. But for international customers, we do accept card payments, either credit or debit. We use other online payments platforms like PayPal, e-wallets, and again, in Africa, cash is still king. So for some African customers, we still accept cash on delivery. But something very interesting to note is when it comes to merchant payouts. So merchants, in this case, I refer to the craftspeople. Craftspeople fall in that group of underbanked and unbanked people in Africa. So they do not have access to traditional forms of banking. So when a customer like you here in Sao Paulo makes an order, we pay out the craftspeople through mobile banking, as I explained how mobile banking works. So let's look at how do we curate categories on the platform, on Mawu platform, and what categories do we normally focus on. So something very important to note is we do not interfere at all with the creative process or the production process of artisans, because we don't want to interfere with that heritage. What we do is we help artisans classify their items or their crafts in these 4 categories that are on Mawu. So our main 4 categories are home and living, fashion and apparel, as I am today, art and collectibles, and gifting. So finally, let's go to customer experience, and customer experience is key. Again, I'd mentioned Mawu is a global platform, and we connect buyers like you here in Sao Paulo with African craftspeople. So one of the things that are key for us is personalization. So right now, if you go to mawuafrica.com here in Sao Paulo, you'll be able to see the platform or navigate through the platform in Portuguese. You can be able to pay and see the amount the product pricing in Brazilian real. And the more you use the platform, you'll start noticing, oh, it's curating preferences based on my activity on the platform. So the other thing that is huge for us is trust and transparency. And this works both ways, with our interaction with craftspeople, but also interaction with customers. So when it comes to craftspeople, we allow them to list the products at their own pricing. And then when an order comes in, the craftsperson gets all the order details for them to fulfill. But now on the customer end, what is very interesting is, for example, if I buy these earrings and I buy them from Naitemu, as a buyer, you can be able to see the craft producer, learn their story, and most importantly, we have a tool where you can tip them and just boost the craft that they're doing. The other thing that we are keen on Mawu is ensuring a secure platform, especially for global buyers if you're going to use card transactions to make payments. So we make sure that we have a very secure platform so that fraudulent activities do not happen. And finally, global shipping. I know you're curious, if you're in Sao Paulo, will you get your item? Yes, you will. So we have partnered with DHL, FedEx, UPS, and other logistics company just to ensure that we can ship to any part of the world. So let me just summarize the experience for you if you are to use Mawu. Right now, if you go to mawu.com, you'll actually be able to browse from over 800 verified craftspeople on the African continent. You can buy directly from these craftspeople in your own language, Portuguese, and in your own currency. And then the other amazing thing is you can co-create with these craftspeople through a unique customization feature that we have on the platform, and you get to learn their story. In this example, I'd given Naitemu's story. So if you buy from Naitemu, you learn her story, the community she comes from, how she learned her craft, and you're able to connect with that heritage. And lastly, and most importantly, is you can get your order delivered to your doorstep, any part of the world. So let's look at challenges. And I would love to invite you here, as we look at the challenges, to think of what are some of the considerations if you're a Brazilian, or what are some of the considerations you need to think about when setting up an e-commerce business in Africa. I'll start with payments. I'd mentioned payments have also accelerated e-commerce, but also payments is still a hindrance for us in Africa, and might be a problem for you when you come to the continent when you're trying to do business. Simply because I'd mentioned 90% of our population is still underbanked or unbanked, so low card penetration is still an issue, and cash is still king. So most customers still want to pay with cash, which makes it very hard for e-commerce platforms to coordinate how cash is collected. The other thing that is quite interesting is logistics, last mile logistics on the African continent. And in this case, I'll talk about the challenges and some of the amazing innovations that are coming about. And you can also think about them when you're thinking about doing business in Africa. So the first issue around logistics is the issue of infrastructure. So we don't have a lot of road networks in Africa, or the infrastructure is not as good, which makes it very hard for logistics people or e-commerce marketplaces to reach the last mile customer. But something interesting that is happening here in the African continent is the use of drone technology. So in Rwanda, for example, they use drones to deliver products to areas where road infrastructure is not available. So it's something for you to think about if you want to come to Africa and do e-commerce. Can I be able to utilize drone technology to reach regions where normally road systems will not be able to access? The other interesting thing or funny thing that happens in Africa is the lack of an addressing system. So one of the things I've really loved about Sao Paulo is that you guys have very specific addresses where someone is found. But in Africa, we don't have that. So in most cases, the delivery person will call you, and then you're like, go to the green gate, or turn to the green gate, go down the valley, up the mountain, as in, that's how it happens. But something very interesting that is happening is around satellite technology. So we are seeing entrepreneurs on the African continent coming up with satellite technology to geo-map digitally some locations that are hard to map physically. So that's something interesting to think and consider about if you want to come and do e-commerce in Africa. So I'll talk about the issue of trust. And I feel like trust is the same all across the world when buying from online platforms. But in Africa, most particularly, trust is a huge thing when buying from e-commerce marketplaces on the continent. This is because e-commerce is now just developing in Africa, so there are little regulations that govern that sector. And one of the things to mention here is that we have very fragile consumer protection rights. So you're not sure if you buy online, what happens if your card is hacked, or what happens if you pay an online platform and you don't get your order delivered. So consumer protection rights and trust is still an issue when when creating an e-commerce marketplace on the African continent. And the other thing just to mention is cybersecurity, being that e-commerce is fairly new in Africa. So cybersecurity is still something to think around. And it's interesting to be here in Brazil because e-commerce is way more developed, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of cybersecurity options that we can also learn from and borrow from in Africa. So finally, I'll talk about internet connectivity. As much as internet penetration has contributed to e-commerce adoption in Africa, the cost of data, or you call them bundles, the data bundle, it's still very expensive for most Africans to afford. So it still forms a challenge of e-commerce. Most of the times when you buy bundles, you're like, let me use them very fast before they expire. So it's still an issue that with time can have like a way to navigate around it. So I'd love to just highlight some major e-commerce players in Africa, and I'll mention a few trends that are common all across Africa, the most common modes of payment, the most common business models used, and I'll also highlight a few popular e-commerce marketplaces. So when you look at Africa in 5 blocks. So there is East Africa, where I come from, there is Southern Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, and North Africa. So in North Africa, the biggest markets are Morocco and Egypt when it comes to e-commerce. In West Africa, the biggest market is Nigeria, and Nigeria also happens to be the biggest e-commerce marketplace in Africa, or market in Africa. Then in Southern Africa, we have South Africa, which happens to be Africa's second largest e-commerce market. And then finally, where I'm from, East Africa, we have Kenya. And Kenya is referred to as the Silicon Savannah of Africa because it's one of the most innovative countries when it comes to technology. But something very interesting across all these regions in Africa is that e-commerce is driven by mobile. So it's mobile first. Everyone has a mobile handset. So if you want to create an e-commerce business in Africa and you're considering to work with African e-commerce businesses, you have to optimize for mobile. So that's one of the things to consider. The other interesting thing that's happening on the continent is social commerce. So you find there are a lot of people willing now to buy items from Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. So I'll just talk about payments again, the most common methods of payments and something to consider when coming to the African continent. The first being mobile banking, which we've talked about, but also card payments, whether it's a debit card, credit card. You can also think around online banking, e-wallets, and again, cash is king. So cash on delivery still remains the most popular way of transfer of e-commerce marketplaces operating on the continent. So I'll just also highlight most popular business models that we have for e-commerce. The most popular one being direct to consumer, like what we do at Mawu. So we like to craft or term the craftspeople as businesses. So we connect businesses, the craftspeople, directly to consumers like yourself. There are other popular models like direct to business, so B2B, and then we have consumer platforms where consumers go on a platform and barter. Finally, I love to just highlight some of the biggest e-commerce markets or marketplaces on the continent. And I'll start with the Amazon of Africa. I don't like using that, but Jumia. So there's a platform called Jumia that's from Nigeria. And Jumia is the largest e-commerce marketplace in Africa. They deal with a lot of consumer goods, electronics, and they're from Nigeria, but they're all spread out across Africa. In South Africa, we have platforms like Bidobuy, Take a Lot. And then in Kenya, we have Kilimall and Mawu that helps producers or creative producers connect with global buyers. So I want to mention, as we wind up, the impact of e-commerce on the crafts industry. And one of the things that I'll mention is crafts industry on the African continent have been very traditional. They're like the brick and mortar industries in Africa. But one of the most beautiful things that e-commerce has done is include this very traditional, traditional industry in the global market. So e-commerce has empowered artisans who will normally not have access to global markets to trade on a global platform. And I'll just talk about some of the SDGs that have been able to be impacted through e-commerce, and one of them being the preservation of cultural heritage in Africa. So as the world changes, even here in Brazil, you notice that human beings are losing that cultural heritage or those things that make us unique. So one of the things that e-commerce has enabled us in Africa to do, and hopefully you can borrow the same in Brazil, is to preserve this heritage, but not only to preserve it, but provide a platform where we can actually exchange this culture with the rest of the world. The other thing to note is, as I'd mentioned, how crafts are produced in Africa. They're produced through such a sustainable way. So we believe that anything produced on the continent should be good for man and good for the environment. So having a platform like Mawu, or by utilizing e-commerce, what has enabled the crafts industry to do is drive this sustainability, ethical production, what we call slow fashion and small batch production. So again, just to capture how the e-commerce platform has been able to enable the African crafts industry. And the African crafts industry is a huge, what we call an impact ecosystem. So right now, if you buy from Naitemu, you're not only empowering Naitemu, but you're also empowering all the other people in the value chain that Naitemu works from. So for example, if you buy from her beadwork, she has bead sellers that supply to her. She has a hand-cut person that helps her carry her items. She has 3 staff members that help her. So when you buy something on Mawu, you not only touch the life of one artisan, but you touch the lives of every person in that ecosystem. So finally, let's look at what are some of the considerations you need to think about if you want to set up a business in Africa or you want to do e-commerce in Africa. So again, mobile first. Mobile is king. You have to optimize for mobile. The other thing to consider is payments. So it's a battle between prepayments and post-payments. As I mentioned, cash is still king in Africa. So you'll have the issue of, okay, if I'm doing post-payments, which is cash on delivery, how do I collect cash in a very effective way? And I'll give an example how we do it at Mawu for cash on delivery. We work with QR technology where the end customer scans a QR code, and then that QR code allows them to be able to pay. So the other thing to consider, again, in summary, when you're setting up an e-commerce business in Africa is logistics. As I mentioned, lack of a national addressing system makes it very hard to access the last end customer. So you need to think about, if I'm doing doorstep delivery, do I start considering drone technology to be able to access areas where infrastructure is not possible, or do I create what we call pickup locations or pickup stations where customers have to go and collect those items? And finally, the customer experience. How do you build trust? You want people to come and use your platform. So do you create a platform where you personalize the buying experience? And one of the things that we've really prioritized at Mawu is that. So right now, for you guys, if you go to mawu.com, we personalize your experience. You can shop in Portuguese, shop in your own currency, and we ship here. The other thing to think about is fraud protection. I'd mentioned e-commerce is fairly young on the African continent, so cybersecurity is something that we really battle with. And I'm very interested to listen to other companies here, especially in this conference, that actually deal with cybersecurity and see if some of those solutions can actually be employed into the African market to protect consumers. Finally, you have to think of the multiple payouts options available for your customers. As I'd mentioned, in Africa, mobile banking is key. So if you're going to come and do business in Africa or trade with Africans, you have to learn something about mobile banking. And I can just give an example of some of the largest mobile banking platforms in Africa being M-Pesa and Airtel Money. And finally, you need to create an easy checkout process. So is it easy for customers to come and use your platform and for them to be able to buy whatever they need and get those items delivered to them? So it's been an honor to speak to you guys and share some insights around marketplaces on the African continent. If you can, scan the QR code and go to mawuafrica.com and just browse some of the amazing collections that we have from African producers. Thank you so much.
Gostaram? Gente, assim, vou falar em português, que é mais interessante. Os desafios são os mesmos. Assim, a gente mudou de lugar, mas a gente está falando, quando a gente fala de operação de marketplace, a gente está falando praticamente dos mesmos desafios. I talk about the same challenges in Brazil for operating the marketplace, okay? And falar com vocês, eu falo inglês. Bom, mas assim, o que é interessante? Did you talk about the regulations? In Brazil is similar, okay? The main tax regulations is very different state or state, okay? Talk about the major difficult or about the regulations impact in the business.
So like most parts of the world, in Africa, we also have a regulation issue, especially when it comes to cross-border commerce within African countries. But there's something very interesting that's happening. There was a treaty passed across African countries called the African Free Continental Trade Agreement. So this has made it easier for African countries to trade, meaning African countries have been able to drop tariffs or customs when you're moving items cross-border. So when it comes to trading with international platforms, now from Africa to the rest of the world, so that's where the challenge falls around. But when it comes to Africa and the US, there's an agreement called AGOA that makes it easier for African creative producers to move their items to the US, and they don't have to pay any levies or any customs. Yeah.
Thank you. Eu vou seguir. Ok? Não, ok, cadê? Short question, okay? It's the first time in Brazil, okay? Did you see any of our handcraft art? And yesterday you met the Feira Preta, okay? Adriana Barbosa. What do you see the possibility for connect in the artisans of Brazil and the African artisans?
So I got the honor yesterday to visit Preta Hub. Preta Hub, yeah. And it was such an honor to see the creative manufacturers here, and they have a lot of similarity to what African craftspeople are doing on the continent. So there is a huge opportunity to collaborate, whether it's moving Brazilian-made creative products to the African continent or moving African-made products to Brazil. So there's a huge opportunity to collaborate, but also to learn. Again, as I'd mentioned, craft making skills on the African continent are not taught in school. So they are passed down through apprenticeship, and they hold such a deep cultural significance. So it will be amazing to get craftspeople on the African continent to also come and share their craft making skills with Brazilian producers.
This is okay. The other question, did you talk about the SDGs, okay? The 11, 12, but I think add the 5 SDG, okay? The equal gender is more interesting, add. But how is the female entrepreneurship environment in Kenya?
I'd say, like in any other part of the world, entrepreneurship mainly is done by men. But it's quite interesting to see in Africa a lot of budding female entrepreneurs. And then the also amazing thing that's happening on the African continent is that there are so many programs that support female founders. So there's a lot of training that happens, there's a lot of connection to investors. So right now it's the best time, I'll say it's the best time for female founders on the African continent because there are so many opportunities for us to grow. The only representation we want to see change is the fact that there are so many programs supporting female founders. However, most of the funding still goes to male founders. So a challenge to African investors, also here in Brazil, please invest more in female founders. Yeah.
Como eu falei, é igual, gente. Só muda. Os desafios continuam os mesmos. Bom, one question about business, okay? How you told me what's your Mawu's average ticket there about? What is Mawu's average ticket? The ticket manager. About average ticket. Okay. How many transactions on average are carried about per month?
Oh, on Mawu Marketplace?
Yes.
So far we've done over $1 million in transactions on the platform, but our average order value for customers is around $135.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And the other question. How does Mawu Africa use affordable credit solutions to empower African artisans? And what are the impacts or these on their lives and business?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. As I'd mentioned, African craftspeople fall under the unbanked in Africa. So normally they will not be able to approach banks and get the traditional funding that normally businesses will do. So what we've done at Mawu is we provide credit solutions for these craftspeople, but we provide them in inventory financing. So for example, if they get an order, but they don't have the cash or the finance to be able to fulfill this order, we give them an advance for them to buy raw materials and do the production, and then they're able to fulfill this order and pay back the loan. So we've been able to provide very affordable, interest-free loans or credit for them to be able to operate because normally they will not access this from banks.
And my other question, how do you see the future of Mawu Africa? And what is your vision for expanding the market and the support for African artisans in the coming years?
Very interesting, the vision for Mawu. So for us, we want to build an immersive experience that any person in the world can plug in and feel connected to heritage, not only on the African continent, but other heritage producers across the world. So it just now happens that we started with Africa, but there's a huge opportunity to create a niche marketplace or a marketplace that actually brings very consumer or conscious products on the platform, products that teach you something new and connect on a deeper level. So that's our goal for Mawu, not only to onboard more African craftspeople, but to onboard more heritage producers or small batch producers across the world and give them a platform for cultural exchange with the rest of the world.
Very interesting. Temos tempo ainda para uma pergunta. They talked about the... Okay. Alguém quer fazer alguma pergunta daqui? Pode falar. Alguém pode? Está vindo o microfone.
Hi, Jennifer. Congrats for your presentation. What is the main technology challenges to make commerce big in Africa, in your opinion, besides payments and logistics challenges?
So it's quite interesting because the other thing to think, or when you mentioned about some of the technological challenges, one of them being training craftspeople on how to use the platforms. So you find that most of them are not that tech savvy. So there's the technological barrier of most people still don't understand how to use technology, especially if it's very tough to use. So you find that when you're building a platform, you really have to simplify it and make it easy for anyone to use. So one of the things that we did at Mawu, especially when dealing with suppliers, was make it so easy that it's just click and play. So you don't try to make it so complicated. It's like simple. Take a photo, upload, add the quantity. So that's one of the biggest issues. How do you train craftspeople? How do you train most people to use a technological platform? Yeah.
Mais alguém? Opa.
Boa tarde. Ei. Chegou? Ah, chegou. A pergunta que eu tenho é referente ao público-alvo que consome os produtos do marketplace no continente africano. Qual é a faixa etária desse público e qual é a região que essas pessoas estão? Obrigada.
She is the target. You sell or buy the products. Age. Where you live?
I believe you've asked who is our target market?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we like to classify our target market as the international retail consumer, and we classify them in 5 levels. So we have the conscious buyer that's very concerned about buying sustainable items. We have the savvy buyer who is very concerned about buying very unique items. We have gifters. And gifters, we like to consider people who want to buy very unique items. We have decorators. And finally, we have a segment that we call the African experience seeker. So this is a traveler who is coming to the African continent but wants to also interact with the items. So it's the international retail customer with those 5 personas.
Mais alguma pergunta? Não. Your first time in Brazil, okay? Do you intend to come back?
Yeah, I might actually not go back to Kenya, but I actually really love it here. There are so many common things between Brazil and Kenya. One of them being the huge meat culture. So we also love meat a lot in Kenya, especially grilled meat. We call it nyama choma. So being here has been feeling like a home away from home. A lot of beans and rice, which we also eat a lot in Kenya. So yeah, I will definitely love to come back here. Yeah.
Okay, I recommend Bahia and Rio to visit, okay? I recommend. Eu sou baiana, gente, eu tinha que recomendar para ela ir na Bahia, né, pelo amor de Deus. Em tempo, eu tenho sotaque em português e em inglês. I have accent in English and in português, okay? Bom, gente, nosso tempo esgotou. Tem um negócio piscando aqui na minha frente, que o nosso tempo esgotou. Estaremos ali se alguém tiver mais alguma pergunta, mas o nosso tempo, infelizmente, já foi, né? Já estão ali olhando para a gente, já todo mundo querendo subir. Obrigada e foi um prazer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you. Oh.
Just a gift for you.
It's very beautiful.
Muito.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Ah.
Opa.
Tá joia. Não. Você figura? Muito obrigado, Janda. Muito obrigado, Jennifer.